All right, I would say where the live stream is up and going, so go ahead and with introduction anytime.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I am excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Daniela Domeisen. She joins us all the way from Switzerland. Thank you so much for making the arrangements despite the time change. So Daniela is an assistant professor at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, and as of most recently, is now an associate professor at the University of Lausanne, also in Switzerland, and for now juggling both positions during the transition with the large research groups at both places. And Daniela received her PhD from MIT in 2012, where she worked with Alan Plum. And a lot of her research throughout this time has been focusing on dynamics and predictability, including subseasonal to seasonal predictability associated with stratosphere troposphere coupling. She's also done some work with MJO and ENSO and the predictability associated with those phenomena. And as related to this talk, also implications for extremes. So thank you so much, Daniela, for joining us. And with that, I will let you take over. Really quickly, we will use both the chat and also if you have a question where you would rather say it out loud, please use the raise your hand button. So we will do the questions at the end of the talk, right? Thank you. Go ahead, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for this very nice introduction. And thank you for the invitation to come talk at University of Wisconsin. Of course, it would be nice to actually be there in person, but I'm sure we can make this work at some point in the future. So what I'd like to present today is work on long-range forecasting of extreme latitude weather. And this is work I've been doing in collaboration with a lot of members of my group and also a lot of external collaborators. I've listed a lot of them here. There is a couple more, so depending on who made which figure and contributed to which paper. So what I'd like to start with is where we actually stand in terms of weekly to monthly weather prediction. And this is a figure that I made back in 2015, but it's still reasonably accurate to show where we have good predictability or poor predictability. So in general, this is the seasonal predictability that we have over the globe, and this is for boreal winter, so December to February. And this is using the Max Planck Institute or system model, which is now the kind of the operational seasonal prediction model of Germany. And what you see is a very general pattern of very high predictability on seasonal timescales in the tropics and rather low predictability in a lot of the areas of the extratropics. So you can see a couple of examples here. There's parts of North America that are very poorly predicted. Also, Europe is what I call the blue blob here. This is a very poor predictability, and also lots of places in the Southern Hemisphere. So a lot of these places are actually very interesting to study because they have certain properties that make them so difficult to predict in the first place. And often this is actually because there is remote forcings that influence these places. And unlike some places in the tropics, where we have these kind of seasonal climate and one dominant predictor, also, for example, ENSO, in the exotropics, there's often lots of different effects that can have an influence. And these sometimes compete, and that makes it much harder for models to actually make a good prediction. But we can improve predictability also in the exotropics. One example we have is in Europe. For particular years, we can use the tropics and the upper atmosphere to increase predictability, and we can actually get to almost similar levels to what we have in the tropics. But these are very limited in time, so-called windows of opportunity, so very particular times when we can get really good predictability from the atmosphere and the ocean. So if you look at the different timescales for predictability, then the nice thing is that basically there's predictability on each timescale. So if you just look at weather forecast, we need to look at atmospheric variability. Then we have to start looking at interactions with the surface in terms of soil moisture. You have to look at the upper atmosphere in terms of the stratosphere. And then once we get to weeks and months, we can look at tropical variability such as the MJO or El Nino, snow cover, and then on longer timescales also sea ice, the ocean circulation. And of course, for very long timescales, if you look into climate change, we can look into how greenhouse gases vary on these timescales and make a prediction for the future. So the nice thing is that basically on each timescale, we have something that helps us make a better prediction. And one of these predictors that I'd like to look at today are remote effects. So things that happen in a completely different place on Earth and that then affect what happens in the place that we're interested in. And I'm going to focus on the mid-latitudes here. Of course, there is also similar effects within the tropics, within the polar regions, but I'm going to focus here now on the mid-latitudes. So how do we think about remote processes that help us make predictions? So on the one hand, we have to first understand the processes by which these remote forcers or forcings influence a particular region that we're interested in. We need to understand their variability, their persistence, and the actual pathway of how such a remote effect gets to the place where we are. And we need to understand when there's actually an influence and which other influences there are. So it's not a simple business, but we can sometimes break it down to a pretty simple diagram here. This is following a study by Scheichel et al. Who looked into compound events. So we can, for example, have a remote persistent forcing. This could, for example, be a very persistent sea surface temperature pattern somewhere over the ocean. And this can then, if it keeps having, for example, if it keeps having the same influence onto a remote area, let's say we have a strong SST forcing over the North Pacific, this can lead to temperature anomalies over land, for example, over North America. Then there's often local drivers or feedbacks such as soil moisture that can enhance, for example, a heat wave. And that extreme event can then lead to a hazard, extreme temperatures, or even a drought. And that has a certain impact on agriculture, on infrastructure, on human health, and so on. So this is kind of the theoretical diagram of what I'm getting at. And the nice thing is that if we have this persistent remote forcing, that gives us a potential to make better predictions. So if something varies very slowly and it keeps having the same influence on a particular region, then we might be able to better predict that particular region. And for example, how often heat waves occur in that location or cold events and so on. And these are exactly the examples that I'd like to talk about today. So I'm going to look at two examples. In the first part, I'm going to look at summer heat waves. And in the second part, I'm going to look at winter cold air outbreaks. So, of course, heat waves are also important for winter, as, for example, they can be large melting events that impact then water availability in spring, which again impact heat waves in summer. And of course, in winter, heat waves are equally important, therefore. And the other way around, cold spells in summer can also have important consequences, for example, on crops. But I'm going to just look at the extremes now, because those are the ones that have the biggest effect on human health, if it gets really hot in summer or if it gets really cold in winter. So in the first part, I'd like to look at summer heat waves. And I just put up that same diagram again, but with a bit more, slightly more concrete steps. So we have some kind of remote forcing, could be a sea surface temperature pattern, could be the MGO, could be any kind of remote pattern, could be sea ice forcing, that can then lead to a land heat wave, which again can lead to extreme temperatures and human health and ecosystem impacts. And I've put some references here for places to kind of connect these different extremes with each other. Of course, we also have local drivers and local feedbacks, such as atmospheric blocking. So remote forcing doesn't just cause a land heat wave. It often goes through, for example, an atmospheric blocking event. And there's, of course, soil moisture feedbacks that can make a land heat wave even more extreme. In addition, atmospheric blocking can also cause marine heat waves, and these marine heat waves can also feed back onto the atmosphere again. But in the ocean, they can have extreme impacts again on ecosystems and so on, as we've already seen with a lot of the recent extreme heat waves. So both land and marine heat waves have extreme impacts on health of humans and ecosystems, and therefore we want to try to understand how predictable are they, how far out can we predict them, and what are really the drivers that can potentially cause them. And if these drivers are, as in this diagram, such a remote forcing, if this remote forcing is persistent and long-lived, then we might be able to actually better predict when a land heat wave or when a marine heat wave actually occurs. I'm going to here focus on land heat waves. And as an example, I'm going to use the 2018 heat wave, which really covered the entire Northern Hemisphere. So here, this is the 2-meter surface temperature anomalies for the average of June to August, so 3-month average in summer 2018. And you can see that there was a heat wave here over North America, there was a heat wave over Europe, and there was a heat wave here in Northern Russia. And these two heat waves get talked about a lot, the US heat wave, California heat wave here, and the European heat wave. The Russian heat wave has so far received a little less attention, but I think people are realizing now this is, of course, not very healthy for permafrost up here in Russia. So this summer had record high temperatures, and there was also drought conditions. So this was an issue for human health. This was an issue for ecosystems and for agriculture. So if we look at dynamical drivers of how something like this could come about, then we often find references to the jet stream. And these conditions can actually often be brought about by anomalies in the jet stream, which then can interact with the underlying land and the underlying ocean. And I'd like to pick 2 examples. Now, this is here a 3-month average, but I'd like to go to 2 specific examples of 2 weeks in the summer that were a bit hotter and a bit cooler than what we saw during this summer in general. The first week I'd like to look at is this one at the end of June, which was actually rather cool here in Europe and also not as hot here in North America. And the second period I'd like to look at is this period at the end of July, when there was actually a very strong heat wave, both over Europe and over North America, at least here along the West Coast. And these 2 anomalies were both linked to the shape of the jet stream that was present during that time. So there was a jet that went south here for the cold anomaly and a jet that went north here for the warm anomaly. And this pattern, if you just basically draw it out for the entire hemisphere, really went across the entire hemisphere, especially here during this extremely hot week. There was a heat wave both in North America and over Europe at the same time. So basically that week at the end of July was extremely hot in both locations. So this comes about through waves that stay in that location. What would usually happen is the jet stream would probably move on from that location, but at the particular time, it didn't really move on quickly enough, and the waves became very stagnant, and that meant that it was hot for quite a long time in both these places. So what does that mean for the predictability? Can we actually predict such patterns, and can we predict in which locations they occur? So I'm taking this example, I'm just looking at in more general terms, can we predict such extreme heat waves? So in general, we can predict theoretically tropospheric weather out to about 3 weeks. So that's kind of the deterministic limit that we have, the kind of the theoretical limit. But if you look at actual prediction systems, often we cannot really get to 3 weeks. So you wouldn't really expect anybody to give you a reliable forecast 3 weeks in advance for a very particular day and tell you that it's going to be hot or cold on this particular day. Now, although prediction systems can't really generate these forecasts yet, it's definitely a crucial timescale for being prepared for emergency management, especially for predicting such an extreme event. Now, the question is, are these extreme events somehow possible to maybe predict earlier than what we see just when we look at normal weather? So I'm showing here a case of predictability for these 2 weeks that we just looked at. So this cold week that we had here at the end of June, and this hot spell that we had at the end of July. So what I'm showing here is what actually happened here, and this is the forecast lead time. So that means this is what was actually, this is what was forecasted, and this is what actually happened. That means that the longer the colors basically stay the same in the vertical, the more predictable something was. For the cold spell, if you look from here, like at the end of June, then you can see that this cold spell here was predictable out to about 10 days, 1 week, 10 days. So not a bad forecast. But the hot spell here was predictable out to almost 3 weeks. So the question is, are hot spells just in general more predictable than cold spells? This is an example now for this particular summer for Scandinavia, where the heat wave is really extreme. There was forest fires in Scandinavia due to the drought that was happening there. So we looked into what is the actual predictability of these hot spells versus the cold spells, and we compared different regions. And I'm here focusing on Western Europe, but the other regions actually look pretty similar, except that Russia always seems to be a little more predictable than some of the other regions. So what we did is we looked at the so-called extremal dependency index, and we checked if hot extremes are better or worse predicted than just average temperatures. And everything that's on the diagonal here means hot extremes are just as predictable as average temperatures. And everything that's to the left of the diagonal means hot extremes are better predicted. And everything that's to the right of the diagonal means hot extremes are more difficult to predict. And you can see that basically for all these different lead times, here this is the lead time, so basically a forecast 7 days in advance, 2 weeks in advance, 3 weeks in advance, and so on. All these different lead times lie to the left of the diagonal, meaning hot extremes are always better predicted than average temperatures. So that's some good news. Heat waves are becoming more frequent, more extremes with climate change, but we may be able to predict them better than if we just had average temperatures. So is this just something with extremes, or does this have to do with hot extremes versus cold extremes? So we checked the same thing for cold extremes, also in summer. And we found that cold extremes are actually not more predictable than average temperatures. So there is something about hot extremes that makes them particularly predictable, as opposed to cold extremes or average temperatures. So let's get back to that extreme hot week and check how predictable that actually was. So if you look at the peak of the heat wave, so that's here at the end of July, that week that I showed you, then this was the actual deviation from climatology. So this is the Area 5 anomalies. You can see in a lot of places, especially in Scandinavia and here, parts of basically all of Northern Europe, it was 4 to 5 degrees hotter than average. So really hot during this particular week. So the question is, how well did we actually predict, or did the models predict what was happening? So we looked at the European model, the ECMWF model, 3 weeks in advance of that particular week. So we looked at initialization on July 9th in 2018. And we see that the prediction is actually pretty good, especially in terms of its location, not quite as good in terms of the amplitude, but it's certainly going in that direction. So we could predict anomalies between about 1 and 3 degrees, not quite as hot as what actually happened, but 3 weeks ahead of time, getting such a forecast is actually really good. So let's look at how this forecast evolved over the different weeks. This is 4 weeks ahead of time. This is the actual observed value, and this is the distribution that the ensemble members actually predicted. So anything that's in red here is a prediction of above normal temperatures. Anything that's in blue is below normal temperatures. So you can see that already 4 weeks before the heat wave, we have much more weight here in the above normal. And actually close to 30% of the ensemble members predicted temperatures above the 90th percentile already, which is quite a lot 4 weeks ahead of time. If we then extend this to 3 weeks ahead of time and 2 weeks ahead of time, you can see that basically by 2 weeks ahead of time, the heat waves was almost perfectly predicted. So basically 2 weeks before the heat wave, we knew what was going to happen there. And you can see that also 3 weeks before, we're definitely going in that direction. And about 60% of the ensemble members already predict temperatures in the 90th percentile or above the 90th percentile. So we actually had a really good chance of predicting and preparing for that particular heat wave. Now, we also looked at the counterpart in North America. I'm not going to show all these results here, but the heat wave in North America that affected California, the exact same week, temperatures reached 51 degrees in Death Valley, and July broke a record that was last set in 1931. So this anomaly here and this anomaly here during that particular week, those were actually almost equally predictable. So about 4 weeks before the heat wave happened, we already had a very good indication that this was going to happen. So what we're trying to figure out now is this due to this particular setup of the wave that we had in this particular week that somehow made it possible to predict these heat waves so long in advance, or was there some other feedbacks that helped? Certainly climate change helped. We know heat waves are becoming more prevalent, and probably also land atmosphere feedbacks played a role in that particular heat wave. So in summary for that first part, temperature extremes can be induced by anomalies in the jet stream, which are linked to blocking and can in turn be induced by prolonged or remote forcings. Summer hot spells turn out to be much more predictable than cold spells or even normal temperatures. And this gives us some hope for long-range prediction of heat extremes, especially as we know that heat extremes are becoming more prevalent. Then it's just a question of how much do we actually trust those forecasts and how often are they actually potentially wrong. So the Northern Hemisphere summer 2018 heat wave is a great example of these concurrent remote heat waves that were highly predictable happening at 2 remote places at the same time. So this is for heat waves, for summer heat waves, where we seem to have a pretty good handle, in particular for some cases where we have really good predictability out to 3 or 4 weeks even. So let's look at what this looks like for colder outbreaks especially in winter. And if you just go to a couple months earlier, before that heat wave happened in summer 2018, we actually had an extreme cold spell in February 2018. Again, this here is the area of the cold spell. And this is the week here at the end of February and early March. And these anomalies here, they go up to about -9 or -10 degrees. That's this anomaly is almost double to what the heat wave anomalies were before for the summer. So extremely cold for this week here in February. And let's look at what the model predicted. So this is again 3 weeks before the cold spell actually happened. And you can see again, there is some indication that it's going to get cold, but again, it's way weaker. I mean, again, here, anomalies are about 1 to 2 degrees maybe, but nowhere close to the actual 10 degrees anomalies that we saw in the observations 3 weeks later. So not as well predicted as the heat wave that we had before. The anomalies are just short of anywhere close in terms of the amplitude. So let's look at those same graphs that we had before in terms of the anomaly distribution of the ensemble members. So 4 weeks before, there is not much of an indication that anything would happen just 4 weeks later. There's a bit of an indication that maybe a higher chance for below normal temperatures than above normal temperatures. If you go to 3 weeks before the event, this doesn't change at all. So 3 weeks before, there was still no clear indication that it was going to get extremely cold. And only 2 weeks before the actual event happened, is there a really good prediction of this cold extreme. So not like for the heat wave where we have kind of a slow progression of the ensemble members towards this hot event. Here, all of a sudden, 2 weeks before the event, we actually get a pretty good prediction, while 3 or 4 weeks, we have basically no indication that it's going to be so extremely cold. This is probably, and this is my guess here, due to an event that happened between here and here. So between 3 weeks lead time and 2 weeks lead time. And this is what happened in the stratosphere at that time. What I'm showing here is potential vorticity in the stratosphere. And what happened was a so-called sudden stratospheric warming. This red area here is counterclockwise rotation in this direction. And what you see is the vortex that's rotating throughout winter. And you see that now we're getting closer to February. And as we get to February 12th, you can see that this entire vortex is splitting into 2 parts that are then interacting with each other. So just showing you a couple of these figures again as snapshots. So here there is rotation around the vortex here. This is about at 30 kilometers height. And this vortex then splits into 2 parts and then basically stays like that for quite a while. Now, the interesting thing is that this happened right between lead time 3 and lead time 2 weeks before this cold spell happened. And interestingly, this is when these stratospheric events happen, the so-called sudden stratospheric warming. They can impact what happens at the surface. And this is probably what happened and what then eventually led to that cold spell. Now, unfortunately, although they have a very long-lasting impact at the surface of several weeks to months, these events themselves are not very predictable. So we have sometimes 2 weeks, but mostly it's just a few days. So there's not very much time that we have once one of these events happens to then predict what the surface impact will be. So when these events happen, we have a range of different impacts. So we have a range of different extreme events that can happen at the surface. So something happens at like 30 kilometers height, somewhere between 30 and 50 kilometers height. We end up with cold extremes here over Northern Europe. We end up with marine colder outbreaks, changes in sea ice distribution, also dry spells here in the north of Europe, and often also flooding in the Mediterranean. It can also lead to extreme winds and storms, storm clusters coming into the Mediterranean here. So there's extreme events in the stratosphere that then happen to cause extreme events at the surface. Now, the interesting thing is that usually the stratosphere is actually much more predictable than anything that happens at the surface. So this is a comparison between here the predictability skill in the troposphere and the predictability skill in the stratosphere. So anything that's below this diagonal here means the stratosphere is more predictable. And all the models that we looked at, these are now subseasonal forecasting models, they show that the stratosphere is more predictable than the troposphere. The issue is just that once one of these extreme events happens, these events in particular are not extremely predictable. But in general, the signal in the stratosphere that is caused by these extreme events is much longer lived and therefore can have a very persistent influence onto the surface. And this is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for signals that are long-lived and persistent in some place that have an influence on another place, and therefore we can gain predictability from that signal. This is the signal that we're seeing here in this plot. This is pressure here, so height is up here. This is about 30 kilometers here where the event happened. And this is the lag or the days with respect to that particular event. So you can see something is happening here. The effect goes through the entire stratosphere, but then also the event is really long-lived. So here you can see an influence in the lower stratosphere for about 1 to 2 months. And every once in a while, there's a little bit of a dripping down into the troposphere to influence the weather down there. So whenever there is this dripping down, this is an increased risk of colder outbreaks over Northern Europe, for example. So this is the type of signal we're looking for. We're looking for something remote, persistent, that has an influence on the place that we're looking for. It can be SSTs, can be something in the stratosphere, can be something in the tropics. Anything can give us predictability for the mid-latitudes. So how does this increased probability of colder outbreaks manifest? Usually we can see it pretty clearly in the North Atlantic Oscillation. So let's go back to that 2018 event when it got really cold at the end of February all of a sudden. And we can look at what the North Atlantic Oscillation did during that winter. So we had a positive NEO for basically the entire winter. This event happened and in the stratosphere, so this is the 7th stratospheric warming event. About 10 days later, the NEO goes very strongly negative. This is exactly what we would expect after such an event, namely a negative NEO, meaning we have this pretty wavy jet stream. We get cold and dry air here over Northern Europe and warm and rainy here. This is why we get these colder outbreaks over here. So what temperature does this negative NEO correspond to? This is a composite now from reanalysis data of what the temperature looks like 3 to 4 weeks after such an event. So corresponding to this negative NEO, we get cold air in Northern Europe, warm air here in Eastern Canada and Greenland, and then rather slightly colder air here over the continental US. So if you look at what this means for the probability of colder outbreaks, we can see a large increase in the frequency after weak vortex events, especially here over Northern Europe. So this is around the time when they occur, and we're going out to 2 months after the event happens in the stratosphere. And we see this here, an increased frequency up to about double the number of cold days as compared to normal up here. This has large impacts on human health. So there is actually a link of these colder outbreaks to increased mortality. There's 2 studies by Andrew Charlton Perez on this that the UK healthcare system actually was doing much worse in terms of health conditions during these cholera outbreaks. So once these events happen, somewhere 30, 50 kilometers height, we actually end up with human health impacts somewhere over Northern Europe. And it's not just over land that we get these impacts, it's also over the ocean. We get an increased risk of marine cholera outbreaks. This means that we have a much higher risk, for example, of freezing of ships, for example, threatening infrastructure. People can't work outside for as long in these kinds of conditions. And one of the biggest risks actually of these marine cholera outbreaks that are happening more frequently here after one of these stratospheric events happen is the higher risk for polar lows, so-called Arctic hurricanes. They're very small, they have extremely strong winds, and they end up with extremely cold and icy conditions, which can really devastate infrastructure up there in the Arctic. So this is something to look out for. They're almost unpredictable, but we know that if we have this kind of environment of cholera outbreaks, these polar lows can form in this kind of environment, and much more likely in this kind of environment. And therefore, this is the time when we have to look out for these extremes. So just to put this back into context and into the diagram we had before, we end up with anomalies in the stratosphere. They happen to be warm in the lower stratosphere. They can last for about 1 to 2 months. This is exactly what we're looking for: remote, persistent conditions that have an influence on the region that we're interested in. This can lead to an increased risk of marine cholera outbreaks and land cholera outbreaks. For the marine cholera outbreaks, we saw that this can lead to polar lows and damage to offshore infrastructure. For land cholera outbreaks, we saw that this can lead to freezing temperatures and extreme human health impacts. Again, this is not a one-to-one linear link. It's not just every time we get these warm lower stratospheric temperatures, we also get these cholera outbreaks. And there's, of course, other factors such as sea ice distribution or local weather patterns in the troposphere that have an influence on what happens there. So the question is, can we actually make a prediction of those cholera outbreaks? You saw an example of the February 2018 cholera outbreak, and that it was predictable about 2 weeks in advance. So let's look at when we actually know something's happening in the stratosphere, and we might want to try to make that prediction. So in general, this is, again, I showed you this figure briefly. This is our truth, so era interim. This is a type of anomaly we get 3 to 4 weeks after the stratospheric event happens. So cold over Northern Europe and Asia, and warm in Eastern Canada. So can we actually predict this pattern if we average over all these events? And again, we're looking at subseasonal models here, so anything on weekly timescales. And in the multi-model mean, these are now all the models that we could find that have stratospheric levels. This prediction is actually pretty good. So we see the same type of pattern that we see from reanalysis after these events. Now, the issue is just that on average, we can make a pretty good prediction of what happens after these stratospheric events. But can we actually predict the response to any individual stratospheric event? And we saw that that wasn't very convincing for this February 2018 event. Actually, February 2018, I talked to the forecasters. Some of them said this was one of the biggest forecast busts for that particular year. So it's actually very difficult prediction once something happens in the stratosphere. So we checked how good the predictability is after these events. And anything that you see here in yellow and red means the predictability is better after a stratospheric event. Anything that's shown in blue means the predictability is actually worse after one of these events. And especially the regions where we thought we'd have a strong influence and an increased predictability, such as Europe and Greenland, actually have a worse predictability afterwards. So this is something we're currently trying to understand. So we have parts of North America where we indeed have a better predictability. Europe has a worse predictability, and we're currently trying to work out why this is the case. Part of it is that not actually all of the stratospheric events have such a downward impact. The troposphere plays a large role in the downward impact of these events. The troposphere has a mind of its own. It doesn't always receive the signal from the stratosphere. So there's a lot of internal variability going on in the troposphere, of course, and that makes it a lot more difficult to kind of trace these remote effects that then have an influence on predictability. So in summary for that second part, we have remote effects from the upper atmosphere. They can lead to extreme events at the surface, for example, cold spells, which then can in turn impact human health and infrastructure. Now, this remote forcing can add to predictability, but the predictability is not really fully realized yet. We're still working on actually capturing that predictability better in models, trying to understand what actually makes the models make a good prediction and what doesn't. So to conclude this and give you a bit of an outlook. So we saw there was heat extremes. They're pretty predictable out to 3 or 4 weeks in general, but also in particular for this particular event in 2018, summer 2018, when we had concurrent heat waves in North America and in Europe. Cold events are a bit less predictable, and this might in part be due to because we're not fully able to simulate the coupling between the upper atmosphere and the lower atmosphere. So the question is, what are these better predictions actually good for? Why do we want to make a better prediction? And will this better prediction actually translate into better warning horizons for a range of different extremes? We looked at how this can potentially be translated into actual impact forecasting. And we looked into what types of emergency management systems are actually already in place in order to use the predictions that we have and improve them. So you see here the different timescales and length scales for the different extremes that we looked at. And the heat waves that we looked at are somewhere up here, where actually we already have operational systems implemented that are doing pretty well. Yellow means there is some type of prototype system, and red means there's really not much in place yet. So one thing that you notice is there's really no connection between the time scale that we're on here and the maturity of the warning system. So it's not like events that take a really long time to develop, we're also better at warning people, unfortunately. Different warning horizons ask for very different measures. So this is something to keep in mind. And early warning systems for many extremes are really still in their early stages. We're getting better, especially with those regions where such extremes have already happened. But we're still working on those. Different regional differences will also call for different preparedness levels or different warning systems. Here's a couple of examples of 3 different types of warnings and warning horizons. So earthquakes, for example, which happen in a matter of seconds and they span a really large spatial scale, there we actually have operational systems implemented in the countries that are affected. So for example, Japan has emergency braking of trains when they detect the first earthquake waves. For drought, which has a much longer time horizons, there we have some prototype systems, and of course these are very regionally dependent. And for windstorms, we really don't have very much of a warning yet. So let's go back to the heat waves that we covered at the beginning, where we have kind of sub-seasonal timescales of a warning horizon, pretty large spatial scales. And there we actually have operational systems in a lot of places that already have experienced such extreme heat waves. For example, Europe, or a lot of the European countries after the 2003 heat waves, which killed tens of thousands of people, there is actually now operational systems that made sure that in the 2018 heat waves, a lot fewer people died during that heat wave. And this was in part due to the better warnings that we had. But still, heat waves can impact human health, they can impact work productivity, agriculture. And one of the main limitations, interestingly, is that we just have limited skill in actually forecasting the heat wave itself. So we still need to work on getting a better forecast and then translating that into actual operational warnings. So to conclude this talk, we can have remote connections in the climate system. They can initiate and sustain extreme weather in remote places. And these extremes include heat waves, cold spells, cyclones, precipitation extremes. I didn't cover all of those here. They all have different predictability limits and ranges. So we're currently working to better understand these connections and therefore improve our predictions of extreme events. And once we have an improved prediction of these hazards, that can then yield an improved ability to actually issue warnings for these extreme weather events and their impacts. One of the issues is that for future climate, it is predicted that some of these extremes, for example, heat waves, are becoming more frequent, more severe, longer lasting. And we don't know yet what exactly is driving all of these extremes and how they may potentially change in future climates. Because if we understand a remote connection now, this doesn't mean that in a future climate, this remote connection will remain exactly the same. So we still need to keep studying those and try to understand what gives us predictability in each type of climate that we're in. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela, for the very interesting talk. We will go ahead and take some questions. I see that Maria has her hand up. Maria, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I had a few questions. So one of my first questions had to do with those figures of prediction skill, kind of following those weak vortex events or stratospheric. I was wondering if you've considered kind of looking at those figures again with like during perhaps other teleconnection events that are happening. So if you look at the predictability following like weak vortex events and strong ENSO events or something like that to see how those are different, or how some other teleconnection pattern may be improving or reducing predictability while
this is usually a bit of an issue because a lot of these different teleconnections actually influence each other. So looking at the stratosphere is a nice way because the stratosphere is usually influenced by all these teleconnections. First, like for example, ENSO, the QBO, MGO, they all influence the stratosphere. They all have a stratospheric pathway that then influences the surface. So for example, we could see that if you just use ENSO as a predictor itself, you're not improving predictability very much. But if you add the stratosphere and ENSO, then you're actually improving predictability by a lot. So yes, adding these definitely helps to increase predictability, and I'm sure you could do any kind of combination of those.
And then I did have one more question. It was regarding the kind of reduced predictability of the extreme stratospheric events. Do you know why the predictability for those extreme events is reduced?
You mean in the stratosphere itself? Why? Right. So the predictability. So this is the predictability that we have for these sudden stratospheric warming. So this is the lead time in days. So basically, and these are all the different bars or different models. And this is the percentage of ensemble members that actually get the event correct. So basically, you can see, 3 models basically within a couple of days before they get a perfect forecast. But then this decreases really quickly. So basically, 2 weeks before the event, you have very little predictability, and these black pattern bars, they're the false alarm rate. So 16 to 20 days before the event, basically have no predictability left. So one of the issues with sudden stratospheric warmings is that they're extremely dynamical events, and they don't have a lot of kind of lead time. You can't really see very strong signals kind of much in advance of the event. So that makes them very unpredictable. We're currently trying to use different machine learning models or methods in order to try to identify if you can see any kind of signal before that gives us any kind of hint of such an event happening. But basically, in the models that we have currently, we're just waiting for the event to happen in the first place, and then we start making a prediction for what happens at the surface. Because the event or the kind of the aftermath of the event is so long-lived, like 2 months, that basically adding that 1 week before doesn't really add so much to the prediction itself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mara.
Newell, go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question. So, if you're predicting the summer heat wave, is there a correlation between the predictability in the tropics or at lower latitude, the correlation between that and the predictability at higher latitude in Europe? So, will a better predictability at tropics increase or decrease the predictability at Europe?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at this specific question. I would certainly think, I mean, what we see is that, for example, the MJO has a strong influence on what happens with heat waves over Europe. For example, you can look at the Caribbean. There's often wave trains coming from the Caribbean, then that can cause heat waves over Europe. So I would certainly expect that if you have increased predictability there, in particular regions, that you'd also get increased predictability over Europe. But I haven't looked at that specific question, so that would be interesting. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Matt?
Hi, Daniela, this is Matt. Uh-oh, my phone, sorry. Do you think that if we consider the two-way interaction between the troposphere and stratosphere, that the kind of forecasting predictability skills that we gain from looking at the stratosphere can be lengthened a little further? I'm thinking of an intuitive interpretation of the 2014-2015 winters, where we had a polar vortex right overhead, and that coincided with a persistent sea surface temperature anomaly in the Pacific that could have excited certain phases of blocking highs and knock the stratosphere, and then finally the stratosphere starts to break down, and then you get cold air outbreaks. But that might be do you ever think about it this way? Like, could be a bit longer of a forecast time starting from sea surface temperature anomalies.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of indications that, for example, if you look at blocking and you can look at upward heat fluxes, you can get a certain additional predictability. Except the fact if the stratosphere actually ends up breaking down in the end, I think is mostly determined internally in the stratosphere. So yes, there's precursors that encourage it, and basically, if you don't have enough precursors in the troposphere, such as blocking or wave flux, the stratosphere is not going to break down. But it's hard to tell. You can even have a sufficient amount of heat flux, and the stratosphere still won't break down because of all the internal dynamics going on in the stratosphere. So I think that's kind of the challenge of understanding, will it break or not? And I feel like it's determined very strongly by just the stratosphere itself. But yes, it's kind of like a sufficient criterion of like kind of a necessary condition that you need in order for the stratosphere to do something. But then it's not sufficient to actually tell if the polar vortex breaks down. But according to my opinion, I think, yeah.
Too nonlinear, I guess.
Yes.
Right.
I have a question, actually, Daniela. This is regarding the paint dripping plot that you showed earlier, where it kind of remained in the stratosphere, and then eventually you saw that impacting, this one, impacting the surface. And I was wondering, what is it that determines whether it is going to impact the surface or not? Is like a local intensity, or what is it that determines that?
Yeah, that's like the big question. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we don't know, but we've tried looking at a range of different things in the troposphere. I think this is internal tropospheric dynamics. So I think sometimes the troposphere is just not ready to receive any kind of signal from the stratosphere, but sometimes it is. This can be determined. I mean, we looked at this, for example, in terms of weather patterns over the North Atlantic region, depending on which kind of regime the troposphere is in, it's more ready to receive a signal or not. So this can be one of the factors. There's also an influence from the North Pacific onto the North Atlantic that can kind of drive the North Atlantic to be more receptive to the stratospheric signal. So those are some of the indications that we found so far. It also depends a bit on how long-lived the signal is here in the stratosphere. So basically, if the signal goes away earlier, then you won't have any dripping anymore. But it seems like, the timing when this comes down is very much determined by the troposphere itself. So I always I visualize it as like the troposphere kind of having its own mind and being so busy with all its internal variability. And then the stratosphere just kind of keeps pushing and keeps giving that signal. And then whenever the troposphere is ready, it just takes it up or not. But it just basically increases the probability of, negative NAO, colder outbreaks, and so on. But it doesn't tell us that it's going to happen for sure, which is one of the challenges for actually trying to determine if we're going to end up with an extreme event over Europe or not. But yeah, that's kind of the big question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Maria?
Sorry, I had one more question I forgot to ask earlier. And it was about looking at the predictability of kind of these heat waves and cold air outbreaks within the same season. Because I know we looked at like kind of heat waves in the summer versus cold air outbreaks in the winter. I'm just wondering how different predictability is for each within the same season.
Yes, so in winter, the signal is actually not as clear. So basically in summer, we see this really clear signal of hot extremes being much more predictable than cold extremes. In winter, I don't think I have the figures here. Check. Here, there we go. So for winter, it's much less clear. So for warm events, they're slightly more predictable than average temperatures, and cold events are also slightly more predictable than average temperatures, but it's much less, it's much less distinct. There's not such a strong distinction between hot and cold extremes in winter. They're just both a bit more predictable than average. So I think in summer there's something about these heat extremes that makes them extremely predictable. It could be, could be land atmosphere feedbacks, could be teleconnections. So there's really something special about those events. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Daniela, for joining us and spending the hour with us for the great presentation. With that, we will end our colloquium. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for